Everyone, we're really delighted to be here. We'll be talking today about our project, Indigenous-led Ecological Restoration. Just very briefly, I'm Libby Lunstrum.
I'm Maddie Stevens.
Paulette Fox, Trevor Deerfoot, and Matt Williamson. They're all part of our team.
And Brandy Harwood as well.
Yeah, Brandy as well. And then Harley Bastain will be joining us in about 20-30 minutes as well. So before we officially get started, I wanted to pass things over to Paulette to start us out with the blessing.
Thank you, Libby. For those of you who are familiar with the Buffalo dialogues that we had for a number of years, from 2009 to 2013. And so a lot of this work comes from those original dialogues. And I was just mentioning to Treff over lunch, it was so nice when we'd come down to Browning and have them here on campus or over at the Arbor. But it was such a beautiful time for our fluent speakers to visit. And so the spirit of the language and the spirit of all that good visiting, kind of wanted to bring it in to the room today as Libby and Maddie and the team share the grant overview. So I just wanted to recall those good tea and bannock sessions with our elders for the ENI initiative, and also open with a blessing. So, hi napi na tu si ai kipita ki kokomeki som hebi so wax spachto bi so wax dance kat some kon xis ti koi ai o ni wa ho ki am xi no poka o ta ki xa ko tsa sa ni kana suka bi am xi esknemat ki xa o ki annex kyo ka onek aki damo tkayo spommo sa mak ik sopoya bi wawani gibata bi sinun ayos pommo sa komita bi oxi tap bi goistum noch begim sa moxi at semoich gags o ki yoki mix o gags ninams gags o ki kanaka si wa spommo sa kutse sa ne kana suka bi tapo taki o tapi sinu ki wa tapi wa o ki anek suka bi kina bi wa mi sami bata bi sini kinoch ko saman achsas to what saman kamotan han. You have a name. Didn't even.
What's that?
You got a Blackfoot name, right?
Yes, Ini Papok, which means Buffalo Dreamer. So, and Maddie.
So you see waterbirds.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I want to start out by just saying how honored we are to be here and honored to work with Treff and Paulette and a number of others. This project would not in any way be possible without the sort of input and partnership. So thank you very much for that. Also, I want to start out by saying we don't have a super formal presentation. Mostly what we're interested in is sort of talking you through what we've been doing. And so we invite questions or comments at any point. And also, hopefully we'll have time for discussion at the end, because more than anything, we're interested in the dialogue of getting feedback and hearing about what you're all thinking. And so we can move some of these contributions forward together. It's really important for us. So we'll begin by talking about the Indigenous-led Ecological Restoration, which is a mouthful, so we say ILR for short. So this is the ILR project. And it officially began about 3 years ago with funding from the National Science Foundation. But the roots of this really go back more than a decade of coming out and having conversations, really early conversations with folks like Paulette about the INI initiative, the Blackfoot-led Buffalo Restoration Project happening on both sides of the Madison line, and coming out to see us as non-tribal, non-Indigenous academics, people located at the university, what we might be able to do in partnership to support that. And so this project is really a culmination of us learning and having dialogues and trying to see what we can do in partnership with tribal partners as academics to support Blackfoot-led buffalo restoration. And I think we'll go to the next slide. And so because this is an academic project, and we needed to have sort of a question that organizes the type of work that we do. And so the question that we started with, that really came out of dialogues with Blackfoot partners, was one about some of the challenges of reintroducing buffalo. Because buffalo or eni are a relative that need a lot of space, but the land has been really fragmented by colonial practices. And so we were interested in this question of what are the colonial legacies, the legacies of settlement on the land, and what does that mean for restoring an animal like buffalo that is not only ecologically significant but culturally significant. And one of the things we learned early on was how the word that got thrown around a lot was like audacious, how audacious the INI initiative was to dream this dream of having INI back on the land despite the challenges, and really confronting and pushing up against those challenges to bypass them and to create new relationships on the land. And so that was the question that really has been motivating this ISLR project. And so to give you the big picture context, the initiative as a Blackfoot-led project is really important in its own right, important for leading Indigenous-led restoration, and also really important globally, in the global context. And the global context here, in many ways, comes back to the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the global treaty on biodiversity. And even the global treaty looks very much to restoration. And the logic there is that we cannot simply protect landscapes that are intact, protected areas, because so much land has been degraded. And so restoring lands, restoring relationships is a really important part of building a more an ecologically healthy world. And so then it raises the question of where do Indigenous-led projects fit into this? And there's a number, welcome everybody. Hi. No, welcome, this is great. So Indigenous-led projects are really an important piece of the global biodiversity agenda. And they're important because there's a lot of Indigenous communities hold a lot of land that are important to restoration. Indigenous land in some cases has been very degraded by colonial practices, but in other cases we see that Indigenous land has more intact biodiversity that needs to be protected. So Indigenous lands are important, Indigenous teachings and relationships are important, but the other piece of this has to do with the ways in which protected areas have dispossessed Indigenous peoples. Like we see this in Glacier with the ceded strip, where protected areas have essentially stolen Indigenous land. And what we'll talk about a bit later is that these restoration projects are also an important antidote to addressing this colonial history of dispossession. It's not the only antidote or answer, but it's a really important piece of the puzzle. So a really important relationship there about thinking about global biodiversity and the importance of Indigenous-led projects. Okay, so I'm going to pass this over to Maddie.
So if we think about this kind of bigger picture, global scale, the kind of motivations and reasons and importance of Indigenous restoration, there's kind of no more powerful story than buffalo. And that stems from kind of a question of why do buffalo need to be restored in the first place, is that this is kind of one of the greatest ecological and human tragedies in the world. The buffalo went from being all the way from present-day Alaska down through to present-day Mexico, 30 million buffalo, the heartbeat of the continent, moving across the landscape in herds of 10, 20, 30,000 animals. And they were the heartbeat of Native cultures also. And so when we talk to people about why it matters to bring buffalo back, we heard so many powerful stories about how this history of genocide is shared and how the loss of buffalo was the same pattern that was the loss of native lands and dispossession from native lands. So if we look at these small fragments of place where buffalo were able to be, and this is actually after restoration. I mean, they were from 30 million down to maybe 1,000 buffalo left on the continent. And slowly through conservation efforts, there was some level of conservation and restoration, but there's still this very, very small area of land where buffalo are today. And so Indigenous-led, tribal-led buffalo restoration efforts have been really an enormous part of getting us back to this point, but more significantly maybe are leading the way to a much, much broader scale restoration and really trying to bring back a connection to buffalo as a relative. So not just conserving a species for its genetics or its kind of biological characteristics, but really bringing back buffalo ini as a relative. And this is happening through all sorts of different initiatives. The Buffalo Treaty has been a big part of that. Intertribal Buffalo Council has been a big part of that. And Blackfeet leadership and Blackfoot leadership has been really at the forefront since the beginning. Paulette and others in the room talked about that. But most of you are probably aware that free roaming buffalo came home to Blackfoot territory last year. And this is really the culmination, or in another sense, a beginning of this incredible, deep, difficult effort to try to bring buffalo home. And so these lessons from this context and Blackfoot-led efforts really have a lot to say to other Indigenous-led restoration projects in other parts of the world, with other species, in other cultures. So a lot of what we're trying to do in this project is think about what are we learning here? What does that mean in these communities, but also what does it mean for the globe? And so our project has been busy over the last couple of years. And the first year or two, we spent a lot of time talking to people. Libby and I did interviews with around 60 people, everyone from Blackfoot elders to parks officials to Montana state legislators to students, people who represented a lot of different perspectives on what it means to bring buffalo back, and gathered, I think we have 3,000 pages of transcripts. So we have this enormous amount of knowledge that's collected around these efforts. And the last year or so has been, 6 months to a year or so has been an effort of trying to put that together into something that makes sense. Meanwhile, we've been doing some work, and Matt can speak to this more, trying to use geospatial analyses and techniques to map that landscape out in a spatial way. And that work has been kind of a slower process of trying to gather data, which is distributed across a bunch of institutions and is very hard to collect in one place, and also do that in a good way that respects Blackfoot data sovereignty. So we're kind of slowly working towards those outputs. But we have been putting together academic papers and more public-facing outputs that draw largely on the interview data and starting to draw on the mapping work as well. And so today we're going to talk through some of the kind of major ideas or themes that have come out of this. And we've been putting those into academic papers as well as things like teaching modules, which we hope will be of use to those of you here at the college. And we worked on a student-led elder dialogue project that we'll talk about a little bit later, and Brandy was a part of that. We have a project website, which will soon be the host for a lot of these things when they get out the door. And we put together a reading list on buffalo, and then we're working towards putting together a final report about what this project has learned. And so this is kind of our first dry run start to that. So thank you all for listening to us test out some of how we're going to present those ideas.
Yeah, and just a few things to add. The final project report, we were sitting and discussing, and we're like, no one wants to read like a PDF. So we're working on trying to do like an interactive story map as a final report that will hopefully be more engaging and will reach a broader audience that has more kind of images and quotes and so forth on that. So in the next 3 or 4 months, we should get that up and running, and that'll be on our project website as well.
And if any of you have ideas for how that would be most impactful, we're all ears right now, and we'll be around next week when one of our students is going to come up and she's going to be putting that together. So her task is to try to talk to people about how to make that useful.
Yeah, and engaging. So, okay. So what we want to talk about in the next few minutes are some of the things that we've been working on, the concrete things. The first, I guess, chapter that one of the first chapters we worked on was focusing on the importance of ceremony and the importance of ceremony and research. And I'd like Treff to say a few words about this, but I want to give a little context. We were on an advisory board meeting, and we were talking about, we've done 60 interviews. We want to think about how to start, telling the story and hearing the voices of people involved in the Indian Initiative. What are some considerations? What should we think about? And we were expecting some sort of like technical things. And Treff's response to that question was, you need to come to ceremony. And it was a very different, as academics, it was a very different answer to that question of what do we do with this data. That the first steps were you need to come, be in community, be in ceremony, and then you can begin thinking about those bigger questions. So Treff, if you're comfortable, maybe you could speak just a little bit about that experience and the importance of ceremony.
Very goed. Guys, can you hear me back there? Okay.
Can they hear a recording?
Oh, the camera lady. Oh my goodness. Can you
Is
hear
okay?
me, camera lady? Okay, thanks. Met some one sequoia. So go ka. A sequoia to you. No, just the being see. Be doch big. So okay. Met just a part of piano speed. See anime. Met just a pinch because in is the books. So so can stop being. Well, people. My name is Treffrey Deerfoot. I come from the Eagle Rivers clan, where the two rivers meet, the Elbow and the Bow, which is where Fort Calgary was. And that was our camping ground, and the main outpost in southern Alberta was Fort McLeod. So as they were building the railway, the surveyors went ahead and they saw that it was really treacherous going through the southern part of the province. So they approached my people, my relatives, were called Bidochbiki, Eagle Ribs. So our camping ground was where Fort Calgary is. And they approached the ancestors and they says, can we put it, the surveyors said, and we want to put it through our winter camping ground, which is the Banff Corridor, Naduixisko, Holy Springs. Eh? So it took a couple of years before they decided, and they no stopping the people that were arriving. So that's how they ended up going through there in that territory. So I speak to this because we got to know where our territories are. Like right now, we had a line of north and south, a medicine line they call it, and like we had to decide, which clan we're going with. Right? We're all related. We're all Blackfoot people, right? There wasn't chewing backbone guy there checking your stats. We freely roam back and forth across this border, right? Because this was our territory. The only thing that describes our territory is East. The berry patches, the rivers, the mountains, the ravines, those were the landscapes or the markers of our territory, of our people. These commercial section lines, those are all imposed on us. Right? So when you go back to the story and what I told my relatives here, is that there was a way of life here, right? And there's a story behind everything. I danced the buffalo headdress. I've been doing that. The man that had it before me, his name is Sigistamina, Black Buffalo Bull. He later became Gotwipitaki, so yellow woman who went to war. That's a very big family in Siksika, yellow women. That's where I come from. And in the early 90s, I took my grandfather's name, Deerfoot, the Deerfoot Trail in Calgary. Again, I've been doing a lot of work in that area. But what I've been doing, getting back to E&E and this initiative, is that I've been a beaver man for about 17 years now. And before that, I did the piercings, and I was in the horns. I'm the leader of the straight up red plume headdress. So I've practiced my ways going back, And what I'm bringing back is some of my childhood memories. Some of you think you don't have that. If you lived with your grandmother and then matus, we like that insect, eh? The same way some of us are here are beaver people. We don't know all 100 songs, but as soon as we like that smudge, the medicine comes up. We start to remember these songs one after another. It's amazing. You know, when you think about just an insect, it's more than that. Gipatapin is a way of life, eh? And you know, these E&E, they've been a blessing. I've worked very good with the community here, gone to Washington, D.C. to legislate at the free roam in Buffalo, and I think we released 100, but I think most of them came back with us. But, you know, part of that is we went to, and we're going to legislate on our own land. We have to go legislate on our own land. That doesn't make sense. So we had some arguments, and I was very active, and I have the story of the buffalo dance. I have the song that goes with that dance, right? And so again, stage by song, we carry those stories forward, right? And those are the things that our future, our kids are going to be able to. I wrote those books in 1990. The elders told me, people are not ready for those stories. And the one is Huxley, the buffalo dance, the chicken dance, and the one that the beaver stick. Eh? I wrote those 4 books. Eh? I had a health scare about 2 months ago. I had a mini stroke, so I thought, wow, geez, I better put these books out there before, you know, because all I did was I mailed these stories back to myself. I think it's called the poor man's copyright. But those stories are going to be in circulation, so that our future children will utilize that information. So our elders, they don't tell you the story over and over again. Pay attention once, and they'll give it to you in great detail, that story. Okay. Mom, if you really want to know that story and that song, you guys are going to burn an incense. You guys are going to burn that smudge. Okay. The same way I'm just of course I took a shower. Like, it was my shower day. You guys are lucky. But I'm the Catholics, they have rosaries. Pray for our community, pray for our leaders, pray for the people who make decisions for us. Start talking about our relatives. And this last little piece is for you. Remember that. So Kibata, that's our way of life. Remember that. Just braiding your hair. Because I have a bundle, I know I have to do that. My grandma, that way of life. My grandma's in the horns 5 times. So I grew up at the Sundance. And I heard those songs all night. That's a beautiful way to grow up. Unfortunately, I had to go to residential school, and first thing they did was cut my hair. You know? So I'm still going to counseling a couple times a month, because I don't want those stories to escalate into the future. I want to have hope, I want to have love, and this is the hardest one, is forgiveness. I have the most difficult time with that, to forgiveness. And the last one in all of that is you can have peace. You can get up in the morning and not scared to open any door, because you have peace. And that's what we're all striving for, is people of the earth. That's what we're striving for. So I want to share quite a bit, but I think we'll get back to the buffalo. I was involved with, we had a ceremony. Paulette, at the time, they brought their beaver bundle to Elk Island. And we opened the beaver there, and the next day they traveled down and they brought your large herd of buffalo here, 87 of them. And the next year we took 12 of them to Oakland Zoo. John Murray and his wife, and quite a few of us went down, and we blessed the paddocks. And I think they brought 40 back this year, if I'm not mistaken, back from Oakland Zoo. So that's kind of the initial part of this whole project, and maybe about 7 years before that, I helped reintroduce the buffalo that are in Banff. We brought 16 deer. They're at 96 right now. 96. So, I mean, so these animals are coming back, and that took 4 years when we were bringing the buffalo back to Banff. They've been there for hundreds of years, but they're studying the insects. They're studying the droppings of the buffalo, whether anybody's going to be contaminated, the animals, or the wolves, and all of these other animals. You have to do certain kinds of research on. But I told him, geez, this is where they came from. They just released the fact. So 4 years later, he says, we should let's listen to Trev. They were here before, they'll be okay. And how many people got thousands and thousands of dollars to research? They should have paid me longer. But that's what it is. To get validated in this colonial structure, there has to be research. But Kistin non, Kipata Kistin non, as a Stimakatana Machina, Agitsini. So as we go and we give tobacco to our elders, and we say, set me up straight, or put me in line, on what needs to be done, That's how we do it, And that guy is we know who the people that are doing this kind of work in our culture. You'll see that the people that are practicing our way, they're the ones that are at the Sundance, they're not out there with a cup there waiting for money to be dropped in. They're doing it, they're doing all of this stuff with the good intention to bless the community. And for me, that's 2 thumbs up for me. So I have a lot more to say, but I'm going to let these young ladies kind of, we gifted them some Indian names, And part of gifting Indian names is, these ladies have been trying hard to bring justice, trying to bring back the knowledge so that it's documented, so in the future that resource will be there for us. And I think it's important, but I think Kistunon Sinigas, the statement here speaks to, if you want to know about a ceremony, then you go to a ceremony. You're not going to say, Trev said this is how the Beaver Bundle opening is. Go to the bundle opening and this is what I saw there. Go back and tell her, this is what I saw. You should have seen these guys were all dancing with these animals. There's healing powers. I saw somebody get well from that. You're talking from first voice. People always say, how's the sweat lodge? I heard it get really hot. I'm inviting you to come to Libby Bird, you come to I'm joking. I think, come to a ceremony, go into a sweat, and know what you're feeling. Feel those energy. Life is about energy. Our creation stories talk about energy. Our Beaver Bundle has that story. The tobacco seeds with 0 nicotine is in our Beaver Bundles. All of these are here for us. We just need to explore and more open this up. So I'll leave it at that because I got a lot more to say. I don't know how to keep quiet yet. My wife lost me out there. Thank you for listening.
We felt really, really privileged to be there in Banff in October, and I think it really, it really meant a lot personally, but it also made Libby and I think a lot more about doing this kind of work collaboratively and what it means to be a good relative from the position that we come from, and how we might be able to support these efforts that are happening by really leaning into opportunities to listen and learn from a very different perspective than we were trained in. And so it's been, it was really an honor to be there in October, and I think has really informed the way that we think about how we're sharing out this research. So yeah, it's been neat to reflect on maybe what I didn't understand at the advisory meeting last year when that invitation was offered, but has been very much at the forefront, I think, of both of our minds since that point.
And I would add on that too, Paulette and Helen were there with us when we received our Indian names and put their hands on our shoulders. And like, it was a really, it's hard to describe, but it was such a beautiful experience. And I think one of the most profound emotions, besides being honored, is this sense of responsibility that comes along with it. And we really, I hope it comes through in what we're going to talk about, to use that responsibility within academia that has historically been really horrible to Indigenous people and like stolen knowledge, and but try to work within the system to push back on the limits of it, to hopefully do things differently and better. And I feel like we still have a lot to learn, but that's really kind of the point from which we're coming from. And one of the things that you'll see on some of the slides that we go through is really trying to honor the voices of the folks involved in the Indian Initiative, and so that we don't ever present the story like it's our story to tell. It's the story of folks like Paulette and Treff and Harley and others, and trying to do justice to that, to chronicle that and to have a record of it. So, but we'd love to hear all of your input on ways of thinking about that later as well. So what we're going to do now is talk through a few of the things we've been working on, and just to give you kind of a flavor for what this looks like in practice. And so we have one published article so far, and it's an interview with Nina Pixie, or Mike Brucehead, who many of you probably know. If you don't know Mike, he's a phenomenal teacher, and I think about 2-3 years ago, he defended his PhD at the University of Lethbridge, and a very notable study about place names, Blackfoot place names in Waterton, and he defended the dissertation in the Blackfoot language, which was a first. It was a really neat sort of way of him to celebrate his culture, and again, to kind of push back against academia, to do it on his own terms. So what the publication is it's essentially an interview that Maddie and I did with Mike, one of the earlier interviews. And it's an amazing interview. We have an audio file that's been published of that. So there's a record. So if you want to go listen to the interview and hear Mike's voice, you can do that. And then the corresponding article is a written article. And we approached the publisher to say we'd like to produce an interview transcript as an article, because what we feel that does is it allows the readers to hear Mike's voice uninterrupted, like very much in context. And so to try to think about different types of academic outputs. And so this is the first one as an interview transcript, and gets into a lot of different themes, but one of which I'll read a quote here from that. Mike explained that the Ini, the buffalo, is part of the process of finding, fighting, and pushing away the whole boarding school syndrome. I think what Treff alluded to as well. I see strength in the buffalo, and the buffalo is giving back that strength to the native people for the better. It took almost 4 generations to demolish our language. It will take another 3 or 4 generations to go back to how we were, back to our original starting point, not necessarily how we used to live, but how we used to think. It will take about 3 or 4 generations to undo this, and we are already in the 2nd generation after boarding school. The people that went to boarding school most recently, now their kids and grandkids are growing up. So it is 2 generations past, 2 more to go, and I think we're going to see a lot of change. So this, very much this message of hope and healing. And for Mike, and this is a theme that came up in many of the interviews, that bringing Ini back and rebuilding that relationship is really pivotal to rebuilding this identity and this strength, and for healing, and to wake up with a sense of what Treff said, a sense of peace and calm. And so thinking about the reintroduction of buffalo, obviously so much more than just getting like an animal back on the ground to fulfill an ecological function, but really, really pivotal to healing. And so then building from there, we actually had a meeting this morning about allotment. And one of the, what we're working on this with and I should mention these papers are co-written with Blackfoot authors, so we're both drawing from the interviews, but really trying to have equity in the writing process as well. But what we're interested here is thinking about the history of allotment, the way that that in this case, the Blackfeet Reservation was allotted, carved up into individual pieces of land that were eventually sold off. And there's a history of dispossession in allotment. There's a history of dispossession with Waterton and the ceded strip, taking land from the Blackfeet, but it also happened internally on the reservation. And so what this part of the project is looking at is how is the history of allotment being addressed? People aren't just sitting by passively and living with that history, but really trying to build a new type of history and thinking about forms of land back, like explicitly buying land back, but also through things like buffalo reintroduction, of having more a sense of a say in what happens with that land and being able to steward that land, even if it's not like outright land back, that there's sort of softer forms of Blackfoot folks getting more control of that land, ownership, rebuilding that relationship. And so to read a quote from one of the interviews related to land back, the person explained that fragmentation, so fragmentation through like allotment of the land here, is a huge problem for bison conservation. That is the thing that needs to be solved for bison conservation in a real sense. Not just maintaining that we have bison as a species, but that we restore bison ecologically, and really importantly, to restore it culturally. So a big piece of this. I think that land fragmentation is only an issue if people's attitudes or policies on those lands differ. And so I won't read through the rest of this, but a lot of what it's getting at is this idea is if you have pieces of allotted land where people agree with one another, that can be really good for buffalo. But the problem comes in when land is allotted and you have different values, that the value side of this fragments the land as well. And so using our project as a way to learn from people, to think about, okay, how is this history being addressed? How is the reintroduction of INI helping make the land whole again, of kind of addressing this history of allotment and fragmentation on reservation here, but also if you zoom out, thinking about Glacier and Waterton National Parks as well, which brings us into the next related piece of this is buffalo reintroduction as a watershed moment for parks. Did you want to?
This one's yours.
Okay. We tried to divvy this up a little bit. I'm forgetting who was supposed to do what. So this map, if you're not familiar with it, it's a map of the Blackfeet Reservation, Glacier, and then the ceded strip, and Waterton, Ghana, and the other Blackfoot nations up north there. And what the map is getting at is that the ceded strip is this piece of land, primarily in Glacier, but also in the National Forest down here, that the Blackfeet never gave up. And that through a series of kind of legal and policy manipulations, the park was able to say, this is our land. It's no longer Blackfoot land. But the Blackfeet have never given that up. There's a sense of, no, we need to get that back. That is our land. And what came up really clearly in the interviews was that the reintroduction of INI plays a really important role here. Plays an important role in the sense that the INI were released up here near Chief Mountain with the idea that this border is arbitrary for them, that they could move freely across this land where the division between the reservation and the park didn't matter. And there was a sense too that once INI, not as animal but as relative, moves back into the park, that gives the Blackfeet people a sense of this really is our land in a very material sense, because we are an important relative of INI. We're here to steward and to care for And so there's a real feel of sort of land back, the kind of political side of land back through buffalo reintroduction. So it's not just about rebuilding cultural connections, but really in a very material sense, getting access to land that's been lost. And we have fantastic interviews and quotes from folks saying, this is just the first step. Like in 150 years, INI will lead the way for that land to be our land. And so, see, this is a quote from a parks official, right? Mm-hmm. And so we talked to parks officials in Glacier, Waterton, also down in Yellowstone, to get their perspective on this. And especially here, I think in Waterton and Glacier, there's a sense of excitement about this as well. And so this is a quote that gets some of that, where the person explained, so that's where we're at with the National Park Service. They ask, is there a need, is there an opportunity to think of parks differently? Like not this sort of colonial model of parks that dispossess Indigenous people, but to really rethink parks as more inclusive. And then they went on to explain that it's still Glacier National Park, and we've got National Park Service laws and procedures to follow that are in conflict with a lot of the tribal interests, obviously like the ceded strip. So there's still a lot of black and white laws and policies that we have to follow on the same track we've been on for 100 years or more. And this is where things become different, where things are improving. What INI has done, though, is let us step out of that kind of institutional Western framework. It's been a truly mutually positive experience, I think, for us to interact at the cultural level, not at a wildlife level. So at like a people level, where wildlife are really important, wildlife or relatives. I feel strongly that for the National Park Service, protecting Glacier National Park is our primary mission, but INI gives us a way to do it more cohesively with the tribe. And it's a good example of us truly reaching that emotional level of partnership rather than just neighbors. And so we see this as this watershed moment where it's not just that parks are different, I think more importantly, that the people working in parks are thinking differently. They're open to new models, open to reintroduction, open to thinking about parts of Glacier as Blackfoot land. Like that's huge. So I think a really important piece of this is that sort of changing perspective and understanding within parks officials. I will say though, another theme in our interviews that came up is that this is all great, but it's not enough. Like this is just the first step, and we need to see a lot more progress. I think we heard this more on the American side than the Canadian side, but both.
Yeah.
So I think really an important watershed moment, but we don't want to give a sense of false, like everything's perfect, because there's still a lot that needs to happen. So then Maddie will take it from here.
And I think one of the most direct examples of that is in this question around hunting. This really touches down this idea of we're kind of at a change in a moment of how parks are thinking, but it's also really uncomfortable. And I think there are a few things that make conservation, like Western conservationists, more uncomfortable than the idea of native hunting in the parks. It puts people's hackles up. It makes people really worried. And I think that's something that has manifested very practically in pretty much complete exclusion of Indigenous hunting from national parks in most of the US, a little bit less so in Canada, but largely as well. And even where some degree of Indigenous harvest has been possible in parks, it's been very closely regulated by colonial authorities. And so the idea that Indigenous people could not only hunt in parks, but manage hunting in parks, and that hunting could be a part of a relationship with wildlife in a park context is really deeply disruptive to the whole concept of national parks that was introduced with Yellowstone National Park. And so when we started talking to people about what's changing in parks and what does it mean to have buffalo in parks, this question of hunting was unavoidable. It's in neither Waterton nor Glacier is it there yet. I mean, buffalo are barely there, but everyone seems to be aware of the idea that this is on the horizon. And they're also looking down at Yellowstone and going, well, you know, if we have buffalo here, and if we're lucky enough for buffalo to really thrive, buffalo thriving means buffalo being hunted. That's how buffalo have evolved with people. And so returning that relationship really necessarily involves hunting. And so this was actually one of the things I really love about this research is it gives me the opportunity to learn things that I really hadn't thought about deeply before. And I think this is an area that we didn't intend to write on, but became such an important theme in the conversations with both parks officials and community members that we really felt like we had to bring that out. And we found kind of, as we were talking to people, a few different ways of thinking about why would hunting in the park, not only outside it, be important. And so that we heard people talk about it being important as a part of food sovereignty, not only because people are able to access food by hunting, but because imagine if you're out on the landscape and you're hunting. The idea of encountering a park boundary as a place where you have to stop that practice is a dispossessing experience and is a way that people are prevented from really practicing skills and knowledge and understandings and relationship with the land. So for food sovereignty, this is really vital. It's also a tool for political resurgence, for things like regaining control over parts of the ceded strip. And then what was probably more surprising to me to learn was that actually there's this real openness to this on the parks side. And there were a lot of parks officials we talked to who saw this as a really powerful management tool and a way to think about managing buffalo in a way that is more respectful, more ethical. I mean, a lot of people brought up the example of the slaughter around Yellowstone in terms of like not indigenous hunting, but the taking buffalo out of the park, putting them on trailers and shipping them to slaughter as a deeply harmful thing to do to a relative. And that hunting is an alternative to that is much more aligned with even parks' ideas of what it means to relate well to animals. So we heard a lot of very positive ideas about bringing hunting back into Glacier and Waterton both. And despite the fact that it was very challenging for people, and the same person who had talked to, who Libby's read the quote from in the last slide, that was a really lovely interview, and he was very upfront about the fact that that was unsettling to him and uncomfortable for him, and it made him uncertain about his mission, but he was open to it. And I think he was open to it because of the dialogues that have happened and because there's this space to connect as people. And another person who was really instrumental in how we were thinking about this question of hunting is Brent Brock. And we wanted to collectively kind of share a moment to offer gratitude to Brent, who passed away in October last year, and share a quote that he shared with us. He said, "One of the original sins of the Park Service is that they remove the people from parks, who are an integral part of that ecosystem as a keystone species. And that's created a lot of problems across the national park system. There's always been this moratorium on any kind of human hunting or harvest of animals inside national parks. You look at Yellowstone and you see how profoundly that's created issues down there. Not knowing how the system worked and knowing that there was indigenous harvest that was part of that system, why are we excluding them from national parks? I think we're seeing for the first time here, both Waterton and Glacier are open to the idea that there could be cultural harvest inside a park to manage this species." Did you want to share anything?
Yeah, so those of you know who knew Brent, he was an extraordinary person and really smart and like fierce advocate of his Blackfoot friends and colleagues, and really funny. And just a funny story from Brent, that's a little Porsche that he's standing in front of that he had rebuilt, and Chief Mountain in the background. And when he passed away, this photo circulated because this was the photo that I think really embodied Brent and the things that he loved and his quirkiness and his love for the Blackfoot landscape in Chief Mountain. So when we think about all the people that made this work possible, for us, Brent's really, I think, really pivotal to that. So we just wanted to acknowledge his presence in this work as well. And as well as his amazing quote. So we have a lot of, it was kind of hard to pick one quote from Brent. So.
Yeah. Another thing that came out of the interviews that we weren't necessarily asking direct questions about to start with, but became a really important point, was that relearning to live with buffalo after all of this history of loss is challenging. And it's not only challenging for non-Indigenous folks who have never lived with buffalo before, it's also challenging for tribal producers, and it's challenging to foster this reconnection. And I think this is one of the things that we were hearing from people was an incredible success in many ways of the initiative was in bringing people back to a relationship with buffalo. So we talked to some tribal producers. We're hoping to talk to more in the upcoming couple of years, but we had a conversation Libby and I did back a couple months ago with Helen to think about what it would mean to coexist with buffalo in Blackfoot territory again. And she, I was thinking, okay, what are the tools? Is it fencing? Is it having good relationships between Blackfoot Fish and Wildlife and producers? Is it compensation for losses? And Helen said, okay, step back. We need to think about what did it mean for us to coexist with buffalo in the first place? What does it mean as Blackfoot people to coexist with buffalo? And then how has that been disrupted? And taking those kind of histories into account, what does it then mean to foster a relationship of coexistence now, given all of the changes that have happened? And a lot of this really centers around cows and around the fact that cattle are a big part of this landscape now as a result of them being introduced during colonial times. But it's not just as simple. People talk to us about, especially producers, but really a lot of people we talked to said, it's not as simple as we need to get rid of the cows so buffalo can come back. It's actually about thinking about these relationships, how these relationships have changed and how we might have a relationship with both buffalo and cows. Because several people pointed out to us that cattle kept a relationship with buffalo alive while they were gone. Cow tongues in ceremony, cow hides, all of these different, even just material parts, but also way in which people interacted with cows out on the land. Cows helped keep that relationship. And so a lot of tribal producers we talked to said, in our way, we honor relationships with relatives, and cows are our relatives too now. And so how do we honor both of those relationships at the same time and make space for genuine coexistence? And so as we were trying to think about writing this paper, the context of the foundations of coexistence in Blackfoot philosophies and ways of life and understandings were really important. And then unpacking how those were disrupted is really all pretty necessary for understanding how we might relearn to live with buffalo. And this is a quote from Helen, who is a co-author on this paper. And I really appreciated this because I think it speaks to the ways in which these lessons can translate to a larger context too. She said, "We're not homesteaders. We can figure out ways to not be in competition between cattle and bison or to fence off the land the way they have. There's a whole other opportunity for us to, on the land that we do have say over, build those models together and go back to that community of harvesting and raising our own food and taking care of the land at the same time. And how do we work with our neighbors outside the reservation boundaries to help them see these are the possibilities? How does this extend to managing public lands? How do we share these spaces not only with each other, but also with reintroduced buffalo?" And what she's really, I think, getting at here, and another point that she emphasized when we talked, was that coexistence with people, like between people and buffalo or between livestock and buffalo, is also about coexistence between people. And a sense of respectful coexistence on the landscape was not how Europeans came to this continent, and it was very much not how the relationships between settlers and Blackfoot folks have unfolded in Blackfoot territory. So you can't really address issues of coexistence with wildlife without addressing inequities and lack of coexistence among people. I'll hand it back to Libby.
Yes, really just briefly about the coexistence piece. One of the quotes that actually came up a few times, but I thought was really important for thinking about coexistence was this reminder to us of folks saying, we're, as Blackfoot people, we're cowboys and Indians. And this sort of like rejecting this essentialized identity that we can only be Indians. And that cowboy identity is part of our identity as well. I think goes back to this idea of coexistence. But it's just, I thought, a really nice quote. So another aspect of the project that we actually have not worked on yet, but we are hoping to work on with Paulette and Harley and a few others, is this theme of buffalo as teachers. This idea that, again, buffalo are not just an animal, that there are teachers, that we have much to learn from them. And this is a short quote, but I think a really important one. This idea that, and so the buffalo is our teacher. It was one of our first teachers, and they taught us how to be a community. They taught us how to be a society. They taught us how to be a human being. They really taught us from the beginning of time. And so I think a really beautiful quote that brings us back to like some of the foundations of the Indian Initiative, of not just bringing buffalo back, but listening to the buffalo.
I'd just like to introduce myself, Harley Bastien. I'm from the Piikani First Nation, and Stoni Taniko Itu Mamaka. I've been involved with the initiative basically right from the offset. Paulette got hold of me and asked me about coming and joining the mission. So it was very interesting, my journey with the knee. Mind you, my journey with the knee started long before the knee initiative. I've been lucky enough to be around bison, Inis, since the early 70s. And I actually speak a little bit of Ini. I spend enough time around them where I mimic their grunts. A couple of years ago, I was doing a film for an organization out of Germany, and part of the filming was on Ini. So we met with Dan Fox. Maybe some of you know Dan Fox. He's a bison rancher down in that Guyana area. So we went over and we visited Dan. We went out to his herds, and Dan has his grandchildren working with him, taking care of Ini, and it was really, really a nice thing to see how his grandchildren and children stepped right into that role. And to me, that kind of fits into just what's set up here. The other place that we went to was down in Siksika, where they have the white buffalo, white bison. They have them in a pen there, and I kind of walked up to the corral there, and a couple of those, and that white buffalo just looked up at me, the bull, the main bull, and come walking right over, and I was holding the rails. Come walking right up and started licking both my hands. To me, that was very special. There was a special connection between me and that old boy, and I still carry that with me. But getting back to the initiative, there was a vision. A certain individual had a vision of returning a knee back to the Blackfoot culture, back to the land. And so we done a lot of work, a lot of interviews, trying to figure out just where we were going and what we were doing from the beginning. So we developed a mission statement saying this is what the knee's about. And a lot of what is being shared today came right from the knee. The mission statement, as well as the name. We had no name, but I kept referring to this in the initiative. Here we're still talking about in the initiative. So a lot of work went into it. A decade of meetings with the elders, with landowners, various, reserve representatives on both sides of the border. And we come away with a pretty clear vision of what Ini is, how Ini is a part of our life, of the Blackfoot, the Plains people's life, and how in the circle of life, the natural order, there's a part of that circle, if you will, that is a blank space when it comes to the Blackfoot people. And that's when
Ini was almost annihilated. And that was the plan of the colonizers from the get-go, because we followed the herds. And when we followed the herds, we went into what they perceived as their states, their lands. And so they didn't want that anymore, so vast millions of bison got wantonly killed. And I'm sure the spirit of the bison back then was screaming out loud. You know, you almost killed all my kind. And to me, I'm a natural animal lover. That deeply affects me when I think about it. And when I think about it, different reactions comes up. First one comes up is the loss of my spirituality as a part. Another feeling comes out as anger. So the need to me is a very personal and can be very emotional topic for myself. But thanks to the work of the Ini Initiative, the Buffalo Treaty, and folks like Libby and Maddie and Paulette and others, we have started a path back to having Ini. Mind you, there's a lot of obstacles. The main obstacle is land mass. We need land to run the bison on. Some will ask, and I've been asked this question, well, what's the advantage of having the bison back? Ini. It's been gone for almost 150 years, and we've existed without them. You know, why even bring them back? And when I hear that, and I've answered back to these questions like this, I said, first of all, you're asking why. My comeback to you is just as basic as your why is, why not? Why not bring the bison back? Is there some reason why it shouldn't be back? Just because it was taken out of the picture? And so, you know, to me, there's no real starting point and ending point with the Ini Initiative, bringing Ini back. Ini should come back because Ini belongs here. Under the eyes of the Creator, Ini has every right to be here. And we don't have to look too far today, just what our species has done to this planet in terms of making it productive, managing it. I have a big problem with land management. Mind you, I've worked in the environmental industry for over 30 years and worked a lot with land management proposals and getting, permits to, develop, and it's all based on environmental impacts, regulatory agencies, and what have you. And to me, it's, when we go down that road, in terms of Ini coming back, Ini has for time immemorial been the landscapers of the plains. I read one when I worked in archaeology with the Archaeological Survey of Alberta. I read one story of this first European that came up on the Canadian side, on the other side of the Madison line, a fellow by the last name of Fiddler, circa 1750. He was a Hudson Bayer, come up west, up to South Saskatchewan, ended up to a trading post up near present-day Edmonton, with the intentions of make his way south to hook up with the Begunny. So he made it to the confluence of the Elbow and the Bow, present-day Calgary. Hung around the trading post, and he hooked up with some Apatoxi Begunny, North Pagan. And he came down with them. It was around this time of the year, too. And he talked about a place where they camped. And based on the land description, I know exactly where that camp was. It was a winter camp. He ended up spending the winter there with them. And he wanted to establish trade with the Begunny in terms of harvesting bison, selling bison plants, pelts. So he ended up with, he spent the winter there, and he recorded a lot of the Begunny there. But the chief told him, no, we will not do that. We will not sell bison pelts to you. We will provide you with moccasins, clothing, food, but we will not kill our relatives. You know, and they give them all the pelts so they can take them over to London and make a big fan belts. That was just coming up of the Industrial Revolution. So it goes back very deep. I don't know if I hit down the right topic or made any sense here, but mind you, I just got thrown into this spot here, and why not? I'm a spokesperson for NIA. I don't care any place, any time. You call me up, I'm going to get up, say something. So hopefully what I said made some sense, and I'll take an exit right, stage left, right here. Thanks, guys. I'll give that back to you.
Thanks, Emily. I will say it's hard for us to go after Harley and Trev and Paulette, so bear with us. Really briefly, for the sake of time, we just wanted to mention that we're working on some teaching modules based on the work designed for students here at the Blackfoot Community College and more broadly, to make the work hopefully engaging and generating some conversations specifically for students. Oh, sorry.
The last thing we want to share in terms of something that's come out of this project is very, dear to our hearts, and is to honor Joe Racine, who we lost last year. Brandy Harwood and I worked with him on the student project, which was a wonderful opportunity to talk to elders and really try to connect youth and elders about what it means to bring buffalo back. I had the great privilege of spending 10 days with Joe up in Canada, and he had the chance to meet our advisors and spend an evening with Treff, sit at a workshop with Paulette, stay at Harley's camp, and we really had an opportunity to get to listen to stories. And that was incredibly meaningful, I think, for all of us. And just to to share his story, just a little bit of his story in appreciation for Joe and who he was as a person. This picture is from a day that Brandy and Joe and I spent goofing around trying to learn about how to use our audio recorder. And we spent the entire day driving around and stopping at random points and trying to record mock interviews. And we laughed our heads off. I remember just like feeling belly sore from laughing so much. And it just, I feel really privileged to have had a chance to work with Brandy and Joe, because I think both of you are such bright, wonderful people who brought a lot of kind of hope to me in this space. And it really brought light to me for how important bringing buffalo back was, but also just how important reconnecting youth and elders is, in terms of making space for culture, making space for laughter, humor, relatives connection. And so, sorry, my words, it's hard to come up with the right words here, but I just want to take a moment to honor Joe and appreciate him for his contributions, appreciate Brandy for your contributions to the project. And we're hoping to share some of these words out and these experiences out in the form of a podcast coming up somewhat soon here. So looking forward to that, and thank you.
I think that that's an important point for us to end on, and thinking about how this work and any reintroduction can honor Joe's legacy as well. It's really an important part of this. So we thought we would just spend the last few minutes having an open discussion. And one of the questions we were particularly interested in, but you don't have to answer this, but just the question of the themes that we've been talking about, we're curious how they might be useful or meaningful or connected to the work all of you do to generate a dialogue there. But I also want to open space for questions that you might have for us, but also for Treff and Paulette and Harley, folks who've been involved with the Indian Initiative from the beginning. It's really an honor for them to be here and hear their words, like firsthand perspectives. So we'll open it up. Paulette, did you want to speak, or?
So I just wanted to maybe speak a little bit about some of my recent, the work that I'm doing, and how this kind of sort of ties in with that. I do, in 2000, I started working with my tribe in 2000 with GIS, and then I led the development of our Environmental Protection Division. And one of the first things we did was using Blackfeet's swift fox reintroduction in the late, like 1998 to 2000 in there. We also reintroduced Sinopegs in our community. And right from the get-go, from that first project, it was clear that elders were saying, like, it was very clear to them that the animals helped us all this time, and now they need our help. So it's time for us. Now it's time for us to do it, but not to do it like Treff was saying, like 4 years of scientific research. It doesn't mean that's what we're gonna do. But like, we're given this relationship with Ini, and what I found in my community was we could talk about any animal, bird, water, land-based, air. But the minute we started talking about buffalo, it was whispers. And we could, interpret it in so many ways, but there was still trauma, there was fear, but there was also love. Like, this was literally the words where Ini dialogues came from, was because one elder came to me after all of our conversation about Ganamyanistibik and the Sinopegs we had just reintroduced. They said, if you really want to understand the heart of who we are as Nitsitapi, this was whispered and right to my heart. If you really want to understand, they stood right by me and in my ear, you have to talk about Ini. You have to. That's the place to start. Everything else will make sense. And this was after, in 2007, after a gathering we had, and everybody's leaving, and I'm watching people walk out the door, and I'm like, this was something I saw. I was given a vision as a young person. This was going to happen in the future, but it was just the most impossible thing. So I always tried to do it in such a way that didn't offend anybody, but when it came directly from the elders, I was going to jump all over it. So buffalo jump all over it. So the elders, they you know, they basically said, it's time. With those words, the following year, the funding I got from the federal government, they held on to it. And we were supposed to do field work during the summer. And we didn't get any funding until January, the fourth quarter. What can we do? And all those years I had been applying for funding from the community to the feds, I'd ask them, why is there no funding for buffalo? Why is there no funding? And they'd have this answer and that answer and this answer and that answer. And so finally this year, they gave me the money so late in the year. I went to one of our grandmothers, our beaver elders, and I said, what do you think? Last year, the elder, as he was walking out, he said, you have to talk about ini. What if we talk about ini? Sugapi. Okay, that's all I needed. And I didn't even go back to the federal government to ask permission. Can we talk about buffalo? We just did it. And I thought, once the report goes in, if they have something to say, they can say it. But I'm not going to go back for funding. I'm not going to make that a thing anymore. So lo and behold, so that was in 2008. And that was the biggest thing that we came up. Why we didn't hear it, you know, cowboy hat, cowboy boots. You know, they're ranchers. What I was told was we had to adapt. We had to get on with our life. And then we hear the grandmothers saying, but they're in all of our ceremonies, every one of our ceremonies. So they never left. It's us. So this whole idea of cultural and conservation, that doesn't exist. So what we were trying to do also at the same time was the border, which is imaginary. That's why we treated with tribes just north of the Madison line and just south of the Madison line. We're trying to sort of demonstrate that border, we're pushing back on that as a colonial construct. And so the dialogues really helped us to come together. So, you know, even though they weren't here or back or what have you, they were already teaching us how to heal just by talking about them. We'd come down here, like I started earlier, I said when we'd come here, there was so few fluent speakers. And they'd tell us, oh, we just miss you. We're so glad when you're coming because we get to come and we get to, you know, and, you know, to visit and tell stories. And it was all about the buffalo and the old language. So for me as a you know, coordinator, I'll say, I'd have a longing in my heart. How can the rest of our people hear these things? So I'm very grateful with technology today that we can do that, and our young people need to hear it. And this last slide, I did have the honor and privilege to meet this young man, and in the loss of our young people, this young man and others, it's just like we don't stumble and rush. We prepare and we act, but we must prepare and act as quickly as possible because of how many young people we want to pass down, but we're going to have a gap in the generations because of what's happening right now. And so those are just some of the things that I wanted to share, that when I go and I meet with, I met in the Trilateral Species at Risk Conference with Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And there was somebody from Parks who presented on the Bison Conservation Initiative, which I'm familiar with. But what I didn't really understand, because of all that work we did, was if we did all that work, then how come this gentleman from Parks is saying, US-led, US will save bison once and for all? Like, we're trying to erase that border. And so I was very lucky to be on the committee to give the folks from each country, to let them know, no more co-opting of our knowledge. Like, we called this a tribal-led conservation and culture initiative because there was nothing to capture what we were doing. But because we don't separate the land, our language, our life, for us it's seamless. but we're trying to find language in English to help that process. So I ended up, after that trilateral meeting, the federal government from Canada, I wasn't there as a federal. They said, we can't call this a trilateral table anymore because Paulette's here. And I used the beaver bundle to show our jurisdiction of species and authority and relationship with those animals. They're the authority, but we are there to uphold the treaty with these animals. We treated with them first. And so we uphold those treaties over time. We didn't just start treatying when settlers and newcomers came. So these were the things that I was struggling with at the trilateral meeting, and I'm sharing with you all so that we can work through these things together as we push back on the colonial structures. And my counterparts in the federal government in Ottawa said, you sounded a little bit frustrated, Paulette. I said, no, well, think about it. Our people have been sounding the alarm bells for how many decades? Maybe you're listening now, but when I hear that the US, it's US-led, I mean, that's taking us back, not just 20, 30, 40 years, 150 years. We might as well go back to the slaughter. Oh, by the way, there was a slaughter of them, but we're gonna save them. Like, we gotta really have that story, that timeline, and really drill down, and that's what I told the feds on the Canadian side, was we really, and Harley touched on that, and it's not that we wanna focus on the negative, but to understand how we go forward. I said, we have to understand totally, in totality, the loss of use cumulatively, spiritually, emotionally, the landscape, how has the landscape lost out because there's no buffalo there? Let's get a clear picture on the loss, not just in 1883 or 1888, etc. Full understanding of that loss and what that means. So then we can start building. Maybe there's a dollar figure, but we shouldn't be scraping the bottom of the barrel to have Indigenous buffalo programs. And you know, on the US side, it's great. We have, you know, millions of dollars, but compensation-wise, because we were never compensated for the loss of it, we're looking well into the billions. And so there needs to be a true case made for that going forward, using both the science and our knowledge is, you know, we have the challenge within our communities right now, within our families, our young people, the rate of loss, suicide, accidental, drug overdoses, all these things our young people are facing. On top of that, they have to face climate anxiety. So these are the things that, you know, I don't want to, you know, say, I'm so happy, everything's good. We know it's a struggle. It's been a struggle, but let's keep going and let's keep these young people safe and pray for them because they need that guidance. And so for me, because I have had INI in my life since I was little, I'm always in dialogue with them. When WCS came to me and said, what should we do? Glacier and Waterton want to do it, but they don't want to lead. What should we do? They've already tried, they can't do it. What should we do? So I based the INI on my master's, how I went to each of the Confederacy. And it's just one small way of going back. I did place names, GIS, over 20 years ago. So I'm so happy to see these things today, but it, you know, hopefully will accelerate now because, you know, it's not that I was frustrated, but the thing about it is my elders are very strict. We must, like it was said, you're told once, you're given instructions, you can't go back, what did you say about that? We really have to pay attention. My elders are very strict. So that's where I'm coming from. This is how we survived over 100,000 years on this land, not because we are lazy or just randomly followed the buffalo. It was this balance of, you know, life, it unfolds. And so that happens with and together we're all in, you know, being. And so that's some of my research right now, is trying to understand how to get Western folks to go back and reconcile their own knowledge so that we can then work together, because there's that healing that needs to occur, because it won't happen, like, there's good efforts, but if we're not looking at our own, like, for example, you're on a plane, it's crashing, you got to put your mask on before you can put somebody else's on. Right now, science, the planet is crashing, and science is wanting to put a mask on us. First, heal, take a breath, go get that knowledge, what's in the depths of Western, and then come. And then you'll have even a more depth understanding on how we can work together.